Look at a map of the world today. It seems so complete, so definitive, with every coastline charted and every continent firmly in its place. We trust these maps implicitly. They are the bedrock of our understanding of geography and history. But what if that bedrock is built on shifting sand? What if there are entire chapters of our planet's story that have been erased? Continents that once held a place of honor on ancient charts, but have since faded into obscurity. This isn't a question of fantasy, but a genuine historical mystery centered on a single, astonishing artifact. Imagine holding a piece of parchment, 700 years old, that depicts a world startlingly different from our own. This is the enigma of the Vinland Map, a document that doesn't just add a new island to the edges of the known world. It fundamentally challenges the timeline of human exploration and dares to suggest that our modern atlases are missing crucial pieces of a much larger puzzle. This map is more than just old. It is a key to a door we thought was locked forever. It shows the North Atlantic with a confidence that would be remarkable for its time, but with one breathtaking addition: a large landmass west of Greenland, labeled clearly as Vinland. This name echoes the Viking sagas, tales of fearless Norse explorers like Leif Erikson, who sailed into the unknown and found a new world rich with vines and forests. For centuries, these stories were considered legends, exciting myths but not confirmed history. The Vinland Map, however, presents itself as a tangible, cartographic claim that these voyages were real and that knowledge of the American continent existed in Europe long before Christopher Columbus set sail. It proposes a radical idea that the so-called discovery of America was in fact a rediscovery, and that a continent we think of as new to the European world was actually acknowledged, mapped, and then inexplicably forgotten. So how does an entire continent get lost? The story of this map is a journey in itself, a tale filled with cryptic clues, fierce scholarly debates, and cutting-edge science. We will investigate its shadowy origins, from its chance discovery in the 1950s to the intense controversy over whether it is a genuine medieval treasure or an elaborate forgery. We will decipher its strange inscriptions and symbols, placing it within the context of a medieval worldview that blended hard-won navigational knowledge with myth and speculation. And we will explore the profound implications of what it shows, venturing into the stories of other phantom continents that have come and gone from our collective consciousness. By the end of this exploration, you will not look at a map the same way again. You will see it not as a final statement of fact, but as a snapshot of our understanding at a particular moment in time, an understanding that is always evolving. This is an invitation to question what you think you know and to join a detective story that stretches across centuries, all starting with a single, mysterious line on a very, very old piece of paper. Picture the scene: a European bookseller in the 1950s, carefully examining a bound volume that had come into his possession. It wasn't a flashy or obviously important book. It was a medieval work known as the Speculum Historiale, or Mirror of History, a common enough text for the time. But as he looked closer, he found something tucked within its binding that was anything but common. There, sewn in with the history, was a separate sheet of parchment, slightly smaller than the others. And on this parchment was a map of the world. At first glance, it seemed typical of its era, showing Europe, Africa, and Asia in the stylized fashion of the 15th century. But then the eye was drawn to the left, to the vast emptiness of the Atlantic Ocean, and there, west of Greenland, was a landmass that should not have been there. An island shaped like a rough, wobbly kidney bean with a clear label written in Latin, Vinlandia Insula. In that quiet, unassuming moment, a historical bombshell had been uncovered. The discovery sent immediate and conflicting ripples through the small world of cartographic experts. On one hand, the potential implications were staggering. Here was a map that appeared to date from before Christopher Columbus's famous voyage, yet it explicitly showed a part of the North American coastline. It seemed to provide the first concrete, visual evidence supporting the Icelandic sagas, the epic stories of Leif Erikson, and his voyage to a land he called Vinland around the year 1000. If this map was genuine, it would force a complete rewrite of the history of exploration, proving that Europeans had not only reached the Americas centuries earlier, but had actually recorded that knowledge on a map. The excitement was palpable. It was the kind of find that scholars dream of, a document that could single-handedly change textbooks. Yet, hand in hand with that excitement came deep and immediate skepticism. The map's provenance, its chain of ownership, was murky from the start. It seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, with no clear record of where it had been for the previous 500 years. Who had owned it? Where had it been stored? These questions had no satisfying answers, and in the world of historical artifacts, a vague provenance is often the first red flag. Furthermore, the map's condition was peculiar. The ink had a strange, faded, yellowish-brown hue that didn't quite match other known medieval inks. Almost immediately, experts began to voice doubts. Was this a miraculous survival from the Middle Ages, or was it an incredibly clever forgery, created to capitalize on the growing 20th century fascination with Viking explorers? The stage was set for a battle that would pit the thrilling narrative against the cold, hard facts of scientific analysis, a debate that continues to this very day. So, with this incredible claim hanging in the air, the map had to prove itself. The question shifted from what does it show to what is it made of. This is where the investigation turned into a high-stakes scientific detective story, employing tools its medieval creator could never have imagined. The first and most crucial test was to determine the age of the parchment itself. Researchers used radiocarbon dating, a technique that measures the decay of a radioactive form of carbon in organic material. The results were clear and seemingly supportive. The animal skin parchment dated to around 1440, give or take a decade or two. This was a bombshell in its own right. It meant the physical material of the map was genuinely medieval, produced decades before Columbus set sail. For a moment, it seemed the mystery was solved. But a map is not just its parchment, it is defined by the ink that lays down its truths. And this is where the story takes a sharp turn into controversy. When scientists analyzed the ink using methods like spectroscopy, which identifies the chemical fingerprint of a substance, they found something deeply puzzling. The main black lines were drawn with a carbon-based ink, common for the period, made from soot or lampblack. However, overlying these lines was a yellowish translucent ink, used for the coastlines and much of the text. And within this yellowish ink, multiple independent studies detected the presence of a compound called anatase. Anatase is a specific, crystalline form of titanium dioxide. Here's the critical point. While titanium is a common element, pure, synthetic anatase of the type found was not commercially produced until the 1920s. It is a defining component of modern pigments. For those arguing the map is a forgery, this was a smoking gun. It suggested that someone in the 20th century had used a modern ink to carefully trace over a genuinely old and possibly blank piece of parchment, creating a fake historical document. Naturally, the defenders of the map's authenticity did not concede. They proposed alternative explanations that are just as fascinating. Could the Anatase have occurred naturally? While extremely rare, there are a few geological deposits where Anatase can form. Perhaps a medieval ink maker, by sheer chance, used a mineral containing Anatase as a filler to thicken the ink. Another theory suggests the compound could be the result of contamination centuries after the fact. Maybe during a past restoration attempt, a well-meaning conservator applied a coating or a cleaning agent that introduced the modern chemical. There's even a hypothesis that the parchment itself was contaminated, perhaps from being stored in a box with modern materials. Each of these explanations is possible, but they require a series of unlikely coincidences, leaving the scientific evidence in a state of frustrating equilibrium. Beyond the chemistry, the map's artistic style adds another layer of intrigue. From a purely visual standpoint, the Vinland Map is a beautiful example of a medieval portolan chart, the detailed navigational maps used by sailors. It features the characteristic network of room lines radiating from wind roses, which helped mariners plot courses. The coastlines of Europe, North Africa, and the British Isles are rendered with a skill and accuracy that matches other known maps from the 15th century. This is the heart of the map's seductive power. A forger would not only need a blank medieval parchment and historically accurate ink recipes, they would also need to be a superb cartographer and a skilled paleographer, capable of perfectly mimicking the handwriting and artistic conventions of a bygone era. The level of expertise required is so high that it almost lends credibility to the artifact. How could one person possess such a deep and multidisciplinary knowledge, and to what end? The map style is so convincing that it almost dares you to believe it, creating a constant tension between the objective data from the lab and the subjective judgment of the human eye. This physical analysis transforms the map from a simple historical object into a character in its own story, one with a potentially double life. The evidence tells a tale of two eras. The parchment whispers of the 15th century, of monastic scriptoriums and a world on the cusp of discovery. But the ink seems to shout from the 20th century, of a time when the Viking sagas had captured the popular imagination, and the value of such a document would be immense. We are left with two compelling, yet mutually exclusive narratives. Either we are looking at an authentic medieval map that has been accidentally contaminated by modern science, a priceless relic that carries a secret we are still struggling to decode. Or we are witnessing one of the most sophisticated and audacious forgeries in history, a masterpiece of deception created to rewrite the past for fame or fortune. The physical artifact offers no easy answers, only a deeper, more complex mystery that lies at the very intersection of history, art, and cutting-edge science. To truly grasp the significance of the Vinland Map, we need to step away from our modern, satellite-perfected view of the globe and immerse ourselves in the mind of a 15th century European. Their world was not a fixed geographical certainty, but a vast canvas where faith, myth, and fledgling science competed for space. The maps they created were not just tools for navigation, they were profound statements about their understanding of creation itself. The most common world maps of the era, known as Mappimundi, were less about getting from point A to point B and more about illustrating the journey of the soul. These were theological diagrams, often circular, with Jerusalem positioned at the very center as the spiritual heart of the world. The farther you traveled from this holy center, the more the map would dissolve into realms of imagination, populated with monstrous races described by classical authors like Pliny, or locations from biblical lore like the Garden of Eden. These maps were sermons in parchment, designed to teach a Christian worldview where every place had a divine purpose and order. Yet, sailing alongside this tradition was a completely different kind of map, born from the gritty, practical needs of commerce and exploration. These were the Portoland charts, and they were the secret weapons of Mediterranean sailors. Unlike the symbolic Mappi Mundi, Portoland charts were all about brutal, practical accuracy. They focused intensely on coastlines, harbors, and ports, with an intricate web of room lines radiating from compass roses to help navigators plot precise courses. Accuracy was a matter of life, death, and profit. These charts were based on the accumulated experience of countless mariners, constantly updated with new information. They represented a growing empirical tradition, a knowledge system built on observation rather than scripture. The world of the Portoland chart was a world that could be measured, sailed, and conquered. This is the cartographic crossroads where we find the Vinland Map, and its genius, or its cunning, lies in how it straddles these two worlds. At first glance, it adopts the familiar, practical language of the Portoland chart. We see the detailed, recognizable coastlines of Europe and North Africa, rendered with a confidence that suggests first-hand knowledge. The network of room lines is present, marking it as a document intended for a practical purpose, or at least designed to look like one. But then, it makes an audacious leap. It extends the Portoland tradition into the terrifying emptiness of the Western Ocean, the Mare Oceanum, a place that on most charts was simply a blank space labeled "Here be dragons" or filled with sea monsters. Instead of monsters, the Vinland Map places a landmass. It doesn't just hint at something, it draws a defined coastline and gives it a name. This act is revolutionary. It takes the empirical, show what you know approach of the sailor's chart and applies it to the ultimate unknown, boldly asserting that the habitable world does not end at the edge of Europe but continues on the other side of the Atlantic. By doing this, the map directly challenges the insular, Europe-centric worldview that dominated the medieval mind. It proposes a dramatic expansion of the oikoumene, the known inhabited world. For a culture that largely saw itself as occupying the center of God's creation, the suggestion of another significant landmass, populated or capable of being populated, was a profound intellectual shock. It wasn't merely adding a new island to the fringe, like the mythical St. Brendan's Isle. It was redefining the very scale and shape of the planet. This context makes the map's existence, whether genuine or forged, so compelling. If it is authentic, it represents a breathtakingly advanced geographical insight that was somehow lost or suppressed for centuries. If it is a forgery, it demonstrates a deep and sophisticated understanding of medieval cartographic principles, created by someone who knew exactly how to make a radical idea look like it belonged within the tradition it was actually undermining. In either case, the Vinland Map is not a passive object, it is an argument. It argues for a bigger world, a longer history, and a braver spirit of inquiry than we often credit to the age before Columbus. While the coastlines and room lines of the Vinland Map sketch a geographical possibility, it is the words written upon it that give that possibility a voice, a story, and a name. Scattered across the parchment are several Latin inscriptions, but one in particular, positioned near that mysterious western landmass, is the true heart of the entire mystery. This text, known as the Vinland Caption, is not a simple label. It is a miniature historical chronicle. It recounts the journey of Bjarni Herjolfsson and Leif Erikson, who, it claims, discovered a new land, extremely fertile and even having vines, which Leif named Vinland. This brief paragraph does something extraordinary. It directly links the drawn island to the legendary voyages described in the Norse Sagas. It's the bridge between cartographic suggestion and documented narrative, transforming the map from a mere chart into a potential primary source, a witness to an event that would reshape world history. The power of this inscription lies in its specific corroborative detail. It doesn't just say land to the west, it names the explorers and provides the etymological origin for the name Vinland, just as the sagas do. For centuries, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red were our only windows into these voyages, texts written down 200 to 300 years after the events they describe. They were powerful stories, but they lived in the realm of literature. The Vinland Map's caption, if authentic, would be the first and only contemporary, non-literary document to confirm these stories. It would be as if we found a newspaper clipping from the year 1000 confirming Leif Eriksson's landing, a piece of evidence that pulls the Viking sagas out of the shadowy realm of myth and into the clear light of history. Naturally, this crucial piece of text has been subjected to intense scrutiny, with scholars of Latin and medieval handwriting, known as paleographers, examining every curve and dot. The debate here is just as fierce as the one over the ink. Critics point to certain letter forms within the inscription that they argue are anachronistic for the mid-15th century. They suggest that the specific way some characters are shaped betrays a hand more familiar with later writing styles, perhaps even from the 19th or 20th century. Some have also questioned the Latin phrasing itself, noting that it seems a little too perfectly aligned with the saga narratives, as if someone were summarizing the known story rather than drawing from an independent medieval source. These inconsistencies, for the skeptics, are the subtle fingerprints of a forger who was incredibly knowledgeable but not quite perfect. On the other side, defenders of the map's authenticity offer compelling counterarguments. They demonstrate that handwriting in the 15th century was far from uniform. There was significant regional and individual variation. The letter forms questioned by critics can, in fact, be found in other authenticated manuscripts from the same period, just from different scriptoriums or scribal traditions. As for the Latin, proponents argue that its clarity and directness are not signs of forgery but of a practical purpose. This wasn't meant to be high literature, it was an explanatory note on a navigational aid. The language is consistent with the functional, straightforward Latin used in other scholarly and maritime contexts of the time. The very fact that it so neatly echoes the sagas, they say, is a point in its favor. Why wouldn't a medieval cartographer summarizing the same event use the same key details? This inscription is ultimately the linchpin that holds the entire claim of the map together. Without it, the landmass west of Greenland could be dismissed as a cartographic error, a misdrawn Iceland, or even a representation of a mythical island like High Brasil. But the text pins it down. It explicitly connects the drawing to the specific historical figures of Bjarni and Leif and the specific event of their discovery. This transforms the map's proposition from a vague "there might be something over there" to a bold "Leif Erikson went here, and this is what he found." It forces a dramatic chronological shift. If this map is genuine, it means that by the 1440s, at least some educated Europeans were aware of a successful transatlantic voyage that had occurred around the year 1000. That's half a millennium before Columbus. This single paragraph of text doesn't just name a lost land. It challenges the foundational timeline of the age of exploration, suggesting that the seeds of discovery were planted not in Spain or Portugal in the 1490s, but in the icy fjords of Scandinavia 500 years earlier. So if the Vinland Map is the tantalizing claim, then the Icelandic sagas are the original, centuries-old testimony. These are not dry historical records but vibrant, sprawling family epics, filled with drama, conflict, and incredible journeys. For the map's assertion to hold any weight, it must find an echo in these ancient stories, and that is precisely where the connection becomes so compelling. The two key texts are the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, narratives that were woven from oral traditions for generations before being written down on calfskin in Iceland during the 13th and 14th centuries. They are our primary window into the world of the Norse explorers, and they tell a story of accidental discovery and bold ambition that perfectly sets the stage for the map's revelation. The adventure begins not with a quest for a new world, but with a simple case of getting lost in bad weather. The Saga of the Greenlanders introduces us to a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson. Around the year 986, Bjarni was sailing from Norway to Iceland to visit his parents, only to learn they had already left with Eric the Red to settle the newly discovered Greenland. Determined to see them, Bjarni and his crew set out across the treacherous North Atlantic, but they were beset by fog and northerly winds for many days. When the weather finally cleared, they found themselves staring at an unfamiliar, low-lying forested coastline. Bjarni, a pragmatic man, knew this wasn't Greenland, which was described as having large glaciers. His crew urged him to land and explore, but Bjarni refused, insisting their mission was to reach his father. Instead, he turned the ship around and sailed north, eventually sighting a second, flat and wooded land, and then a third, which was mountainous and icy. Only after sailing east from there did they finally reach the Norse settlement in Greenland. Bjarni was criticized for his lack of curiosity, but his unintended voyage had revealed a sequence of new lands lying to the west. This is where the story passes to a more famous figure, Leif Erikson, the son of the formidable Eric the Red, founder of the Greenland settlement. Inspired by Bjarni's tale, Leif purchased his ship, gathered a crew of 35 men, and around the year 1000, set out to retrace the route in reverse. The sagas describe him systematically exploring the lands Bjarni had seen. First, he came to a barren, stone slab land he called Helluland, meaning slabland, which historians believe was likely Baffin Island. Sailing south, they reached a forested shore with white sandy beaches, which Leif named Markland, or Forest Land, almost certainly the Labrador coast. Pushing further south, they eventually found a place so idyllic it seemed like a gift from the gods. The sagas describe a temperate climate where the grass remained green through the winter and rivers teeming with salmon. Most importantly, they found wild grapes growing in abundance, a vital resource for a culture that valued wine. Leif named this fertile place Vinland, which translates to Wineland. They built sturdy turf-walled houses and spent a comfortable winter there before returning to Greenland with a cargo of valuable timber and grapes, their success ensuring the story would be told and retold for generations. The level of descriptive detail in these accounts is what lifts them from pure myth into the realm of plausible history. The sagas don't just say they found a nice place, they provide specific, observable geographical features. The progression from a cold, rocky land to a flat, forested one, and finally to a more temperate, resource-rich region, matches the actual coastline of northeastern North America with remarkable accuracy. The mention of wild grapes is particularly significant, as they do not grow in Greenland or Iceland, but their range extends to areas like the Gulf of St. Lawrence and New Brunswick. The sagas also describe encounters with the indigenous people, whom the Norse called Skraelings, a term that likely referred to the Beothuk or Dorset peoples. These encounters were sometimes peaceful, involving trade, but often turned hostile, a detail that adds a layer of gritty realism to the narrative. This isn't a story about finding an empty paradise. It's a story about encountering a new world that was already inhabited. For centuries, however, these sagas were viewed by many scholars as exciting legends, great stories of national pride for Icelanders, but not necessarily hard history. They were epic poems subject to the exaggerations and distortions of oral storytelling over 200 years. The discovery of the Vinland Map, therefore, created an electrifying possibility. It wasn't just a map, it was a potential missing link. If the map was genuine, it represented a direct cartographic descendant of the knowledge first gained by Leif Erikson. It suggested that the story preserved in the sagas had been known and believed by medieval cartographers who had incorporated it into their understanding of the world. The map became the physical artifact that could anchor the literary tradition in a concrete reality. The interplay is powerful. The sagas provide the rich, narrative detail of the discovery, while the map offers a silent, visual confirmation of its geographical result. Yet, this relationship is also a double-edged sword for the map's authenticity. A clever forger, after all, would have known the sagas intimately. Creating a map that perfectly illustrates a well-known story is exactly what a hoaxer would do to make their creation believable. The correlation between the map's Vinlandia Insula and the sagas' Vinland is almost too perfect. Does the map prove the sagas are true, or did the sagas provide the blueprint for a brilliant fake? This question lies at the heart of the mystery. The sagas stand as a magnificent and detailed record of what could have been. The map is the provocative piece of evidence that dares to suggest it actually was. Together, they form a puzzle where each piece seems to support the other, yet the final picture remains frustratingly unclear, waiting for one final, undeniable piece of evidence to snap it all into focus. The debate over the ink and parchment of the Vinland Map can feel like a theoretical exercise, a battle of scientific analyses and scholarly interpretations. But across the Atlantic, on the windswept northern tip of Newfoundland, the theory collides with undeniable physical reality. Here, the story of Norse exploration steps out of the realm of parchment and ink and into the solid, tangible world of archaeology. The controversy surrounding the map becomes almost secondary when you stand on the site known as Atlantis Meadows, a place that offers not arguments but proof. This is where legend was literally unearthed, transforming the Viking sagas from compelling folklore into confirmed history. The discovery of this site reads like an adventure story in itself, driven by a single man's conviction. That man was the Norwegian explorer and writer Helge Ingstad. For years, Ingstad had been fascinated by the Vinland sagas, and he became convinced that the key to finding the real location was not to look for a permanent, thriving town, but for a small, seasonal base camp described in the texts. He reasoned that the Norse would have sought a site with a protected harbor, ample resources for boat repair, and meadows for grazing their animals. In the summer of 1960, after studying old maps and sailing along the coastline, Ingstad and his wife, archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, arrived at the small fishing village of Atlantis Meadows. When a local fisherman showed them some overgrown, grassy mounds that looked unnatural, Ingstad's heart must have raced. They resembled the foundations of old Norse turf houses he had seen in Greenland and Iceland. What followed was a meticulous 8-year archaeological excavation that would revolutionize our understanding of world history. Anne Stein Ingstad led a team that carefully peeled back the layers of turf and soil to reveal the unmistakable outline of a Norse settlement. They found the remains of 8 buildings, all constructed in the classic Viking style. These weren't crude shelters. They were substantial, multi-roomed structures with low, stone-lined walls topped by thick roofs of sod. The largest hall was long enough to house dozens of people. The layout was identical to Norse sites found in Iceland and Greenland, a blueprint that was uniquely Scandinavian. But a building's shape can sometimes be misleading. The true confirmation came from what was found inside. The archaeologists uncovered a smithy, a workshop containing a forge and an anvil stone. Crucially, they found iron slag, the waste product from smelting iron. This was a technological signature. The Norse were master ironworkers, while the indigenous peoples of Newfoundland at that time were not known to have smelted iron. The presence of a forge proved that this was not just a landing site, it was a base for repair and maintenance, a place where the Vikings could fix their ships and tools for further exploration. Alongside the iron slag, they discovered a small, bronze cloak pin of a style common in Norse clothing, a stone lamp, and a spindle whorl used for spinning wool. Each artifact was a silent witness, a tiny piece of evidence that collectively built an irrefutable case. The final, undeniable seal of authenticity came from radiocarbon dating. Samples of charcoal from the hearths and other organic material were sent to laboratories. The results consistently pointed to a date of around the year 1000 AD, give or take a few decades. This was the exact period when, according to the Sagas, Leif Erikson and his followers would have been active. The coincidence was too perfect to be a coincidence. Erlans Ox Meadows was not a later settlement. It was a 1,000-year-old site that perfectly matched the historical and literary timeline. In 1978, UNESCO recognized its immense significance by designating it a World Heritage Site, the first and only confirmed Norse site in North America. So, how does this incredible discovery relate to the Vinland Map and the Sagas? Erlans Ox Meadows itself is not the lush, grape-laden Vinland of the stories. The climate in northern Newfoundland is too harsh for wild grapes to grow. Instead, archaeologists and historians now believe it served as a strategic gateway, a base camp or a way station for expeditions traveling further south. The Sagas describe Leif Erikson establishing a base camp from which exploration parties set out. The buildings at Erlans Ox Meadows, with their clear evidence of woodworking chips of butternut wood, were even found. A tree that grows much further south suggested was a place where ships were repaired and crews prepared for journeys into richer, more temperate land. It was the operational headquarters for the exploration of a region the Norse called Vinland. This interpretation brilliantly bridges the gap between the archaeological evidence and the saga descriptions. It confirms the core truth of the narratives that the Norse not only reached North America but established a foothold, while explaining why the specific location of the main settlement described in the sagas has eluded discovery. The existence of Erlans Ox Meadows does something profound for the Vinland Map debate. It may not prove the map is authentic, but it validates its central geographical premise. Before this discovery, the idea of a medieval map showing part of North America seemed fanciful, a cartographic fantasy. After 1960, it became a historical possibility. The map's depiction of a landmass across the Atlantic was no longer an impossibility. It was a representation of a place we now know the Norse actually visited. The archaeological proof from Newfoundland gives the map a new kind of credibility. It shifts the question from "could this be real?" to "is this map a genuine medieval record of a real discovery?" Erlans Ox Meadows provides the solid ground of fact upon which the more ethereal mystery of the parchment can rest. It tells us that whatever the truth of the document itself, the world it portrays was not a myth. The Vikings were here, so we arrive at the central, burning question that has consumed scholars for decades, the very core of the Vinland Map enigma. Is this a priceless window into a forgotten past, or is it one of the most sophisticated and alluring forgeries ever created? This isn't a simple yes or no debate. It's a high-stakes intellectual battle where every piece of evidence has a compelling counter-argument, and the line between truth and deception remains blurred. The controversy itself is a fascinating story, a perfect example of how history is not just about finding facts, but about interpreting them, a process filled with passion, skepticism, and the constant evolution of science. The most powerful weapon in the forger's arsenal is without a doubt the chemical analysis of the ink. The discovery of Anatase in the 1970s was a seismic event. Think of Anatase as a fingerprint. This specific crystalline form of titanium dioxide is a hallmark of modern industrial processes. It's a key ingredient in 20th century paints, plastics, and inks because of its brilliant whiteness and stability. For it to appear in a substance claiming to be medieval ink was like finding a microchip in a Roman helmet. It seems to scream modern fabrication. Proponents of the forgery theory argue that a clever hoaxer working in the 1920s or 30s could have obtained a genuine blank parchment from the correct time period, perhaps from a damaged medieval book, and then carefully drawn the map using an ink they concocted. To make the ink appear old and faded, they might have used a yellowish binder, inadvertently including traces of modern, synthetic anatase from their pigments. This single scientific finding for many is a case closer, but the map's defenders are not without their own compelling scientific rebuttals. They point out that anatase, while rare in a pure form, does occur naturally in the environment. It can be found in certain mineral deposits. Could a medieval ink maker, by sheer chance, have used a clay or earth pigment that contained tiny, natural crystals of anatase as an impurity? It's a remote possibility, but not an impossible one. Another, more plausible theory involves contamination. The map has been handled, studied, and potentially restored multiple times over the centuries. What if, at some point before its modern discovery, someone applied a coating or a preservative to the parchment to protect it or enhance its appearance? This substance, a varnish or a gum, could have been contaminated with modern anatase. Over time, this contaminant might have migrated into the ink lines, creating the false chemical signature we see today. This argument turns the smoking gun into a potential accident, a tragic case of well-intentioned preservation masking the artifact's true age. Beyond the chemistry, the debate extends into the more subjective realms of art and history. Skeptics point to the map style, noting subtle inconsistencies in the handwriting or the depiction of certain coastlines that might betray a modern hand trying a little too hard to mimic medieval conventions. They also highlight the remarkably convenient timing of its appearance. The map surfaced in the 1950s, a time when public fascination with Viking explorers was surging, partly fueled by new archaeological discoveries and a growing Scandinavian-American pride. What better moment to unveil a document that seemed to confirm every romantic notion about Norse seafaring prowess? The potential financial and reputational rewards for such a forgery would have been enormous. This circumstantial evidence paints a picture of a perfect storm where motive and opportunity align. Yet, those who believe in the map's authenticity offer a powerful counter-narrative based on the sheer depth of knowledge required to create such a forgery. To be convincing, a forger would need to be a master cartographer, an expert in medieval Latin paleography, and a historian with a nuanced understanding of 15th century geographical knowledge. They would have to not only draw the map correctly, but also write the inscriptions using grammar, vocabulary, and letter forms that would pass muster under the microscope of experts who dedicate their lives to studying such details. The level of interdisciplinary genius required is almost superhuman. Furthermore, if it were a forgery, why would the forger make Vinland so ambiguous? Why not draw a more recognizable North American coastline to make the point undeniable? The map's restraint, its subtlety, some argue, is a point in its favor, suggesting a medieval mind working with fragmentary information, not a 20th century mind with a clear agenda. This great controversy is more than just an academic squabble. It's a microcosm of how we piece together the past. It pits the hard, seemingly objective data of chemical science against the nuanced, interpretive skills of art historians and literary scholars. It's a tug of war between two ways of knowing, and perhaps the most important lesson is that the controversy itself is valuable. The relentless scrutiny, the back-and-forth debate, is the engine of historical verification. It forces us to question our assumptions, to refine our techniques, and to acknowledge that the past rarely surrenders its secrets easily. The Vinland Map, by refusing to yield a simple answer, has become a permanent and provocative monument to the complexity of history, a puzzle that continues to challenge and fascinate in equal measure. So if Vinland was real, what kind of place was it? The map gives us a shape, the sagas give us a story, but piecing together the actual geography is like assembling a puzzle where half the pieces are missing. The label Vinlandia Insula on the parchment suggests an island, but the Norse sagas describe a coastline so vast that the explorers needed to sail along it for days. This is the first clue that Vinland was likely not a single settlement or a lone island, but a name given to an entire region, a stretch of North American shoreline that the Vikings explored. Think of it not as a dot on a map, but as a territory, a concept similar to how early European explorers would later use terms like New France to describe a huge, ill-defined area. The Norse were practical people. They named places after the resources they found. Helluland was the barren slabland, Markland was the essential forest land, and Vinland was the prize, the wineland. This focus on resources is our best guide to locating Vinland on a modern map. The saga's description of wild grapes is the most critical geographical clue. Grapes are fussy plants. They require a specific climate to grow wild. They do not survive in the harsh, subarctic conditions of northern Newfoundland, where Elands Orks Meadows is located. This tells us something profound. The base camp at Elands Orks Meadows was a gateway, a strategic harbor from which exploration parties ventured much further south. The growth range of wild grapes, specifically the Vitis labrusca species native to North America, extends along the Atlantic coast down to Florida, but its northern limit is crucial. It grows in New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia, and even reaches into the warmer microclimates of the Gulf of St. Lawrence and parts of New England. This biological fact effectively draws a circle on the map, indicating that the heart of Vinland, the place Leif Erikson described with such excitement, must be sought somewhere within this fertile zone. But the Vikings were not just looking for grapes, they were seeking everything a struggling Greenland colony lacked. Timber was arguably even more vital. Greenland's Norse settlements were perched on the edge of the Arctic, a land with few trees suitable for building ships and houses. Markland, likely the forested coast of Labrador, provided this essential resource. Vinland, however, offered a richer bounty, not just lumber for construction, but also the raw materials for a sustainable outpost. The sagas mention mild winters where cattle could graze outdoors and rivers full of salmon. This combination of resources, timber, grapes, fertile pasture, and abundant fish paints a picture of a land that was not just a temporary camp, but a potential new home. The Norse were assessing its capacity for long-term survival, which suggests their explorations would have been thorough, probing river systems and coastal inlets to find the most promising locations. When we look at the Vinland Map's crude depiction with this in mind, its accuracy becomes more impressive than its errors. The map shows Greenland with a recognizable shape, and to its west, it sketches a large island labeled Vinland. While modern geography confirms North America is a continent, not an island, the map's portrayal is surprisingly logical from the perspective of a sailor approaching from the North Atlantic. A voyage from Greenland would first encounter the myriad islands of the Canadian Arctic, then the long coastline of Labrador, and finally the large landmass of Newfoundland, which could easily be misinterpreted as a significant island blocking the way south. The map's placement of Vinland relative to Greenland is reasonably correct in terms of direction and relative distance. It doesn't show the intricate details of the Gulf of St. Lawrence or the long coast of Maine, but it captures the essential first impression of a major landmass across the sea. This suggests that the Norse knowledge encapsulated in the map, whether genuine or based on later understanding, was derived from real sailing experience, not pure guesswork. This interpretation leads to a thrilling possibility that the Norse exploration of North America was far more extensive than we have physical evidence for. Erland's Ox Meadows proves they arrived, but the description of Vinland implies they ventured deep into the continent's potential. They may have sailed south, perhaps discovering the rich fishing grounds of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, or even reaching the coasts of present-day Maine or Massachusetts. The butternut wood found at Erland's Ox Meadows, a tree that grows hundreds of miles to the south, is a tiny, silent testament to these longer journeys. Each river mouth would have been an invitation, a potential route to even more fertile lands. The Norse were masters of coastal exploration, and it is unlikely they would have stopped at the first spot they found. Vinland, therefore, represents a lost chapter of exploration, not just because it was forgotten by Europe, but because we have only uncovered the first page of the story the Vikings themselves wrote. Theirs was a continent in waiting, a discovery that was simply ahead of its time, lacking the population pressure or economic incentive to be fully realized before it faded into the realm of saga and legend. The mystery of Vinland invites a fascinating question. Was it a unique case or part of a much broader pattern of cartographic imagination? The answer lies in the vast, empty spaces of ancient maps which were rarely left truly blank. Across centuries and cultures, mapmakers populated the unknown with phantom continents and legendary islands, creating a world that was often more complete in their minds than in reality. The Vinland Map is a particularly compelling chapter in this long and colorful history of geographical speculation, a tradition where hope, myth, and miscalculation danced together on parchment. One of the most persistent and grandiose of these phantoms was the great southern continent, known to Renaissance scholars as Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown land of the south. This wasn't a small island but a colossal landmass that, according to the logic of the time, was necessary to balance the weight of the northern continents. Greek philosophers like Aristotle had theorized that the world must be symmetrical to be stable. Since there was so much land in the northern hemisphere, surely an equally large continent must exist in the south to prevent the planet from tipping over. This idea captured the European imagination for centuries, and mapmakers confidently drew this hypothetical continent, often labeling it Terra Australis non dum cognita, or southern land not yet known. It was a place of immense potential, imagined to be rich in gold, spices, and other treasures, our ultimate prize for exploration. This phantom continent drove explorers like Captain James Cook, who was secretly instructed to search for it on his voyages. Cook's circumnavigation of the globe in the high southern latitudes in the 1770s finally proved its non-existence, but for hundreds of years, Terra Australis was a very real presence on the world map, a testament to how powerful theoretical elegance could be in shaping geographical understanding. While Terra Australis was a continent of theory, the Atlantic Ocean was a breeding ground for islands of myth. Two of the most famous were High Brasil and Antalya. High Brasil, not to be confused with the South American country, was a phantom island said to lie off the west coast of Ireland. Celtic folklore described it as a place shrouded in mist, only becoming visible once every 7 years, a land of eternal youth and advanced civilization. Its persistence on nautical charts was remarkable. It appeared on maps from the 14th century well into the 19th, a stubborn ghost that sailors sometimes claimed to have glimpsed. Then there was Antalya, the island of the seven cities. According to legend, it was settled in the 8th century by 7 Christian bishops fleeing the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. Each bishop founded a city, and the island became a thriving, isolated Christian kingdom. This story gave Antalya a powerful religious and cultural resonance, and it appeared so consistently on charts that when Christopher Columbus planned his voyage, he reportedly took its existence into account. The name itself would later be borrowed for the Antilles Islands in the Caribbean, a perfect example of a phantom name being transferred to a real place, forever linking legend to geography. These phantom lands were not simply mistakes. They served profound psychological and practical purposes for the societies that created them. First, they acted as a balm for fear. The empty spaces on a map, the vast Mare Tenebrosum or Dark Sea, were terrifying realms of the unknown. Filling them with islands, even mythical ones, made the ocean seem less like an endless, impassable void and more like a space that could be navigated and understood. For a sailor setting out into the Atlantic, the idea that there might be a friendly island like Antalya somewhere along the way was a powerful source of hope and courage. Secondly, they represented unfulfilled goals and aspirations. The repeated appearance of these lands on maps kept the dream of discovery alive, encouraging generations of explorers to push just a little further. They were placeholders for future knowledge, a way for cartographers to say, "We know there is more out there, even if we cannot draw it precisely yet." Finally, they embodied deep-seated cultural myths, like the desire for a lost utopia or a refuge for a displaced people. High Brasil tapped into ancient Celtic otherworlds, while Antalya reflected the Iberian Christian Reconquista spirit. Maps, therefore, were not just scientific instruments. They were cultural diaries recording the hopes, fears, and dreams of the age. This rich context is what makes the Vinland Map so uniquely compelling. It doesn't fit neatly into any single category. Unlike the purely theoretical Terra Australis, Vinland was based on specific, documented exploration narratives. And unlike the purely mythical High Brasil, it has been corroborated by hard archaeological evidence at Elands Orks Meadows. The map exists precisely at the intersection of documented exploration and the tradition of cartographic speculation. It represents a moment when a real discovery, gleaned from the Norse Sagas, was entering the geographical knowledge of Europe but had not yet been fully verified or understood. The mapmaker, working with fragmentary information, was doing what mapmakers have always done, taking a report of a land to the west and giving it a form, a name, and a place on the chart. In this sense, Vinland was a phantom continent in transition, on its way from being a legend to being a confirmed fact, a journey that would, ironically, be interrupted for centuries. It forces us to look at all these cartographic ghosts with a more open mind, to wonder if they are all pure fiction, or if some, like Vinland, are echoes of real events, waiting for the right key, the right archaeological discovery, or the right reinterpretation to step out of the shadows and into history. While the Vinland Map captures our attention with its daring Western edition, it also holds a key to another colossal mystery, this one stretching to the east. Look closely at the depiction of Asia, and you will find a label for an immense territory, Tartaria. To our modern eyes, this name might seem obscure, but for a medieval European, it evoked a land of almost mythical power and terror, a vast empire that represented the ultimate frontier of the known world. This was not the Siberia we know from modern maps, a defined geographical region of Russia. On charts like the Vinland Map, Tartaria is something far grander and more nebulous, a continent of the imagination, a placeholder for everything Europe feared, desired, and did not yet understand about the heart of Asia. The origins of the name itself are telling, rooted in the seismic shock that reverberated across Europe in the 13th century, the Mongol invasions. These mounted warriors, emerging from the steppes with stunning speed and brutality, were like a force of nature to the kingdoms of Christendom. To the Europeans, they were the Tartars, a name often consciously linked to the Greek Tartarus, the abysmal pit of the underworld. This was not just a geographical label, it was a moral and theological judgment, casting these new invaders as demons from a hellish landscape. The land they came from, therefore, became Tartaria, a realm of almost supernatural dread. The Vinland Map, by inscribing this name so prominently, is not just drawing a border, it is recording a deep cultural trauma, a memory of the time when the East was an existential threat. Yet, alongside this fear grew a powerful and contradictory legend, one that also became entangled with the idea of Tartaria, the myth of Prester John. For centuries, a story circulated through Europe of a magnificent Christian king, a priest-king named Prester John, who ruled a wealthy and pious kingdom somewhere in the distant East, beyond the lands of the Muslims. This kingdom was said to be a utopia, filled with wonders and immense armies, waiting to come to the aid of its European brethren. As knowledge of the Mongols grew, hope flickered that these terrifying new forces might actually be the armies of Prester John, poised to crush Islam from the rear. The map's Tartaria, therefore, exists in a state of fascinating tension. It is simultaneously the homeland of the demonic Mongols and the potential location of a fabled Christian ally. This duality perfectly captures the medieval European view of Asia, a mixture of sheer terror and desperate hope, a place that could be either their salvation or their doom. The physical depiction of Tartaria on the map is just as revealing as its name. The cartographer draws its western edges with some confidence, showing boundaries with known regions. But as your eye travels eastward, the detail dissolves. The rivers become speculative, the mountain ranges vague, and the eastern edge of the landmass simply fades away into the unknown, hinting at a vast ocean that the mapmaker could not yet conceive. This undefined border is a powerful visual metaphor for the limits of European knowledge. Tartaria was understood not as a country with clear borders, but as an immense, almost endless expanse. It was a geographical black hole swallowing up explorers and information. This vagueness allowed the imagination to run wild, filling the void with every conceivable wonder and horror. This portrayal of a vast, ill-defined Tartaria stands in stark contrast to our modern, precise maps of Asia. Today, we can pinpoint cities, trace national borders, and see the entire continent from satellite imagery. For the medieval mind, such precision was impossible. Their maps were compilations of second- and third-hand accounts from travelers like Marco Polo, mixed with classical texts and pure speculation. Tartaria was the ultimate product of this process, a composite sketch of a civilization, built from fragments of truth and layers of legend. It was less a real place and more a concept, a necessary category for everything that lay beyond the reach of direct European experience. In this sense, the loss of Tartaria from our modern atlases is not the loss of a real continent, but the loss of a certain way of seeing the world. We replaced the mysterious, qualitative empire of myth with the measured, quantitative states of Russia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia. We gained accuracy, but perhaps we lost a sense of the world's immense, unexplored mystery. The story of Tartaria on the Vinland Map reminds us that every map is a cultural self-portrait. The fears of demonic hordes, the hopes for a Christian savior, the awe in the face of a vast unknown, all of these are etched into the parchment alongside the coastline. The map tells us just as much about the people who drew it as it does about the lands they were trying to depict. Tartaria was a continent of the European mind, a shadow cast by its own ignorance and ambition. And in that shadow, we can see the outlines of a world where geography was inseparable from theology, legend, and fear, a world far more complex and imaginative than any satellite image could ever convey. This brings us to a pivotal and often misunderstood player in this entire drama, the powerful and pervasive institution of the Catholic Church. When we consider a map that seems to show lands beyond the known Christian world, we have to ask a crucial question. Was the Church a force that actively suppressed such dangerous geographical knowledge, or was it, in fact, a primary driver of exploration, eager to bring new souls into the fold? The answer, as with so much in history, is not a simple either-or, but a complex and fascinating interplay of both. The Vinland Map itself provides a tantalizing clue that pulls us directly into this debate. One of its Latin inscriptions makes a specific reference to a papal directive. It mentions that the Norse discoveries were made known to the Holy See, and that a papal legate had even been assigned to the newly converted Greenlanders. This note, if genuine, is explosive. It suggests that the highest levels of the church hierarchy were not just vaguely aware of these Western lands, they were officially informed and taking an active interest. This wasn't a secret whispered in a dark corridor. It was, according to the map, a matter of official ecclesiastical record. This single detail transforms the narrative from a lone Viking adventure into a story with potential implications for Vatican policy. So why, if the Pope knew, did this knowledge not set off a wave of European colonization in the 11th or 12th centuries? This is where we encounter the concept of selective attention. The Church, like any large institution, was not a monolith with a single mind. It was a vast network of monasteries, bishoprics, and scholarly circles, each with its own priorities. Knowledge of a distant, cold land called Vinland, reached by a perilous journey across the stormy North Atlantic, may have been filed away in certain monastic libraries precisely because it did not align with the more pressing goals of the era. During the height of the Crusades, the Church's primary geographical and military focus was firmly fixed on the East, on the Holy Land, and the struggle against Islam. A new land to the west, reportedly inhabited by hostile Skraelings, offered neither the immediate spiritual prestige of recapturing Jerusalem nor the legendary wealth of the Indies. It was, from a strategic standpoint, a distraction. This leads to a compelling theory that knowledge of Vinland was not so much suppressed as it was deemed irrelevant for widespread consumption. It might have been preserved in specialized geographical texts or within the closed circles of scholars who studied such curiosities, but it never entered the popular imagination or became a catalyst for action. Think of it like a classified document in a modern government, not actively hidden from everyone but restricted to those with a need to know. For most of medieval Europe, there was no need to know about Vinland. The economic and evangelical returns were seen as too uncertain, especially when compared to the well-established trade routes to the east and the spiritual imperative of the Crusades. The loss of this continent, therefore, might have been a quiet, bureaucratic sort of forgetting, a decision based on cost-benefit analysis rather than a conspiracy of silence. To truly understand the Church's position, we must also appreciate the delicate theological tightrope it was walking. Medieval Christianity operated within a cosmology heavily influenced by the Bible and classical authors. The world was understood as a divine creation with a specific order and purpose. maps like the T and O Mappamundi, with Jerusalem at the center, were not just maps, they were visual sermons illustrating this sacred geography. The sudden introduction of a significant new landmass that had no mention in scripture or in the works of ancient authorities like Ptolemy could be deeply disruptive. It challenged the very completeness of God's revealed world. This created a fundamental tension between the growing body of empirical knowledge gathered by sailors and traders and the established scripture-based world view the Church was tasked with defending. Yet to cast the Church solely as an opponent of new discovery would be a grave error. The same institution that cherished a static, biblical cosmology also possessed an insatiable intellectual curiosity. Monastic scriptoriums were the data centers of the medieval world, where monks meticulously copied not only religious texts but also the works of Greek and Roman geographers. Many of the great medieval scholars were clerics who saw the exploration of God's creation as an act of devotion. Furthermore, the Church had a divine mandate to spread the gospel to all corners of the earth. The promise of millions of new souls to convert was a powerful motivator. This evangelical impulse would later become a central justification for the voyages of Columbus and those who followed him. The Church's relationship with geography was not one of simple suppression, but a constant, dynamic negotiation between preserving orthodox belief and fulfilling its mission to encompass the entire globe within Christendom. The story of the Vinland Map sits precisely in this tension, a ghost from a time when the map of the world was still being drawn, and the Church was both its guardian and, paradoxically, one of its most ambitious cartographers. This idea that Columbus might have been following a trail of breadcrumbs left by earlier explorers fundamentally reshapes our understanding of his famous voyage in 1492. The traditional narrative paints him as a solitary genius, a visionary who defied the flat earth beliefs of his time to prove the world was round based on his own calculations. But the reality of 15th century Europe was far more complex. Educated people, including Columbus, knew the Earth was spherical. The real debate was about its size. Columbus famously and incorrectly argued for a much smaller planet, which made the voyage to Asia seem feasible. But what if his confidence wasn't just born of a mathematical error? What if it was bolstered by whispers, by fragments of maps and sailors' tales that suggested lands were, in fact, reachable across the Western Sea? The existence of a map like the Vinland Map, whether he saw it or not, points to a world where such knowledge could have been circulating in the very ports and courts where Columbus sought funding. We know Columbus was an avid collector of geographical intelligence. He wasn't working in an intellectual vacuum. He pored over the works of classical authors like Ptolemy and studied contemporary travel accounts, most notably the writings of Marco Polo. But his research likely extended beyond books. There are persistent accounts, though debated by historians, that he traveled to the far north, possibly to Iceland in 1477, and certainly to the Irish port city of Galway. These were not random destinations. Both places were hubs of Norse heritage and maritime activity. Iceland, in particular, maintained a direct cultural and genealogical link to the Viking Age. In the taverns and harbors of these northern outposts, the sagas of Leif Erikson and the lands to the west were not ancient history. They were part of the living oral tradition, stories passed down through generations of sailors. It is almost inconceivable that a man as obsessed with westward expansion as Columbus would not have listened intently to such tales, piecing them together with other clues to build a case for his audacious plan. This possibility transforms Columbus from a man taking a blind leap of faith into a shrewd, if still mistaken, strategist. his journey begins to look less like a desperate gamble and more like a calculated expedition based on a synthesis of available information. He wasn't simply hoping to find something, he had reason to believe he would. The Norse voyages, even if their details were fuzzy and their geographical understanding imperfect, demonstrated that crossing the Atlantic was physically possible. They proved that ships of the era could survive the journey and that there was land on the other side. For a navigator trying to convince skeptical monarchs to invest a fortune, this was a crucial piece of evidence. It meant the central question was not, is there land out there, but rather, what is the nature of that land and how far away does it lie? This subtle shift makes Columbus's famous persistence, his decades of lobbying the courts of Portugal and Spain, seem less like stubbornness and more like the conviction of a man who believes he has uncovered a vital secret. The implications of this are staggering for the standard history of the age of exploration. It suggests that Columbus's voyage was not the absolute beginning of transatlantic contact, but rather the moment when a subsurface current of knowledge finally broke through to the surface of European consciousness. The Norse discovery was like a seed that lay dormant for centuries, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. Those conditions arrived in the 15th century with the decline of the overland Silk Road, driving a desperate search for new sea routes to the riches of Asia. Columbus, in this revised narrative, becomes the gardener who, perhaps without even knowing the exact origin of the seed, recognized its potential and nurtured it into a world-changing event. His discovery was, in a very real sense, a rediscovery, the culmination of a process of geographical learning that had been interrupted but never entirely forgotten. This doesn't diminish the monumental courage of Columbus and his crew, but it does humanize him. It places him within a broader tapestry of exploration, connecting him to the Viking adventurers who came before him. The Vinland Map, then, is more than just a controversial artifact. It is a symbol of this lost continuity. It represents the tantalizing possibility that the map of the world was being assembled in fragments long before the great names of the age of exploration were ever recorded in the history books. It hints that history is not a series of isolated breakthroughs, but a river of knowledge with many hidden tributaries, some of which run deep beneath the surface, only to emerge when the time is right to change the course of everything. Just as the debate over the Vinland Map reaches a fever pitch, another enigmatic chart emerges from the shadows of history, adding a second, equally baffling layer to the mystery. This is the Zeno Map, published in Venice in 1558, but claiming to document a voyage that took place more than a century and a half earlier. The story behind its creation is a saga in itself, involving a prominent Venetian noble family, a shipwreck, and a secret alliance with a mysterious northern prince. According to the narrative published alongside the map by a descendant named Niccolo Zeno, his ancestors, the brothers Niccolo and Antonio Zeno, embarked on a series of voyages in the late 14th century, around the 1390s. After being shipwrecked on a remote island, they allegedly entered the service of a powerful lord named Zichmni, who is often identified as Henry Sinclair, a Scottish nobleman with claims to the earldom of Orkney. Under his command, the Zeno brothers purportedly explored the North Atlantic, venturing to lands that sound astonishingly like Greenland and even the coast of North America. When you look at the Zeno map, it presents a strangely distorted yet eerily recognizable vision of the North Atlantic. It shows a massive, misshapen Greenland, but one that is undeniably placed in the correct general vicinity. To the south of Greenland, it depicts a large, fictional island called Friesland, which would stubbornly appear on maps for centuries afterward, confusing countless navigators. But most intriguing of all, to the far west, the map shows a landmass labeled Estatilland. The description accompanying the map describes Estetland as a prosperous country with large forests, sophisticated inhabitants who had books and traded with a neighboring region called Drogeo to the south. To many modern scholars, this description of a timber-rich land with a complex society sounds unmistakably like the northeastern seaboard of North America. Here, then, is another map from a completely different origin, making a similar bold claim about pre-Columbian contact. The parallels with the Vinland Map are both striking and deeply puzzling. Both charts emerged from different corners of Europe, one from a potentially monastic context, the other from the heart of the Venetian maritime empire. Both point to European knowledge of lands across the Atlantic long before Columbus, and most frustratingly, both are shrouded in intense controversy over their authenticity. Skeptics argue that the entire Zeno narrative is a clever fabrication by Niccolo Zeno the Descendant, created to bolster the prestige of his family during a time of intense exploration and national rivalry. They point to the fact that no original manuscripts from the 14th century voyage have ever been found. The entire story is based on the 16th century publication. Furthermore, the island of Friesland is a complete phantom, a cartographic ghost that has never existed. For critics, this is a clear sign that the map is a compilation of sailors' told tales, misunderstood reports, and outright invention, perhaps based on earlier maps that are now lost. Yet, defenders of the Zeno map's core validity offer a different interpretation. They suggest that the inaccuracies, like the gigantic Friesland, could be the result of a simple cartographic error. What if Friesland was actually a mismapping of the Faroe Islands, or an exaggerated representation of Iceland? The seemingly accurate outline of Greenland, they argue, is harder to dismiss as pure coincidence. It suggests that the Zeno brothers, or the sources they drew upon, did have genuine first-hand knowledge of that coastline. The description of Estetland, while romanticized, could be a distorted account of the Norse settlements in Greenland or even hearsay about the mainland passed down through maritime networks. The map might not be a perfect record, but rather a fragmented and muddled echo of real geographical knowledge that was circulating among sailors in the North Atlantic. When we place the Vinland Map and the Zeno Map side by side, a fascinating pattern begins to emerge. It starts to look less like two isolated anomalies and more like separate pieces of a broader, hidden narrative. Imagine a faint, crackling signal of transatlantic discovery, a signal that was being picked up in different places and at different times across Europe. In the icy fjords of Greenland, the signal was strong. It was the lived experience of the Norse settlers. But as that knowledge traveled south to the scriptoriums of Central Europe and the merchant houses of Venice, the signal grew weak and distorted. It was filtered through scribes who had never seen an iceberg, through merchants who prized a good story, and through mapmakers who were trying to fit radical new information into a classical worldview that had no place for it. The results were maps like the Vinland and Zeno charts documents that contain kernels of truth surrounded by layers of misunderstanding, speculation, and myth. This idea of a fragmented, underground current of geographical knowledge is incredibly powerful. It suggests that the official history of exploration, with its clear dates and celebrated heroes, might be overlooking a much messier, more interesting reality. The ocean was not an absolute barrier. For centuries, Basque whalers may have been fishing the rich cod grounds off Newfoundland, keeping their locations a closely guarded secret to protect their livelihood. Irish monks seeking solitude may have ventured far into the Atlantic, and the Vikings, of course, were actively traveling and trading. Gossip, maps, and sailors' logs would have moved along trade routes through ports from Dublin to Genoa. The discovery of America, then, may not have been a single event, but a slow, sporadic process of accumulating intelligence that occasionally bubbled up to the surface in documents we are only now learning to decipher. The true mystery is not whether someone reached America before Columbus, but how much that knowledge influenced the world and why it so often slipped back into the shadows, waiting for a future generation to recognize it. To truly appreciate the gulf between the Vinland Map and a modern Google Maps view, we need to understand that we're not just comparing different levels of technology, we're confronting two entirely different ways of seeing reality itself. A medieval mapmaker and a modern cartographer are engaged in fundamentally different projects. One seeks to illustrate a world imbued with meaning and purpose, while the other strives to measure a world of physical facts. This is the core of the shift, a move from a qualitative worldview to a quantitative one. For the medieval mind, the most important truths about a place were often invisible. Where was it in relation to the Garden of Eden or Jerusalem, the spiritual center of the world? What mythical creatures or saintly legends were associated with its regions? A map was a moral and theological landscape as much as a geographical one. It answered the question, what does this place mean? This is why the great Mappamundi often look so strange to our eyes. They are diagrams of salvation history, not navigation charts. The Vinland Map, with its blend of practical portolan charting and its bold insertion of a legendary land, sits right on the cusp of this older tradition. This rich, symbolic approach to cartography began to fracture with the dawn of the Enlightenment and the rise of the scientific revolution. Thinkers like René Descartes and Francis Bacon championed a new ideal, that true knowledge must be based on observable, measurable data, free from the contamination of superstition, myth, or religious dogma. The world was to be treated as a giant machine whose workings could be understood through mathematics and empirical observation. This philosophical earthquake inevitably changed map-making. Cartography was reborn as a rigorous science. The goal was no longer to depict meaning, but to achieve a God's-eye view of objective reality, to create a perfectly accurate representation of the Earth's surface, devoid of any cultural or spiritual bias. This required the development of precise surveying tools, standardized scales, and most importantly, a grid of latitude and longitude that could pinpoint any location with mathematical certainty. The map was being stripped of its stories to become a pure tool of measurement. This relentless drive for quantification is why a continent like Vinland simply vanished from our official atlases. From the perspective of Enlightenment-era cartographers, Vinland was not a verified discovery. It was an unsubstantiated claim, a ghost story preserved on a questionable piece of parchment. It had no fixed coordinates that could be confirmed by independent observation. It did not appear on the meticulously surveyed charts of Captain James Cook or the other great explorers who systematically filled in the blanks of the world map. As the centuries passed and no further European power rediscovered a land called Vinland, it was logically categorized as a cartographic error, a misidentified Iceland, or perhaps a total fabrication. It was edited out of the geographical record because it failed the new, strict test of empirical verification. The land was lost because our definition of what constituted a real place had become drastically narrower and more demanding. This creates a fascinating paradox. In our quest for perfect accuracy, have we lost something valuable? The modern map is an unparalleled triumph of precision. It can guide you turn by turn to a specific coffee shop in a city you've never visited. It can show you the depth of the Mariana Trench or the height of Mount Everest. But in achieving this magnificent objectivity, it has also become, in a way, sterile. It tells you where something is, but it is silent on why it matters. It shows you a coastline, but it doesn't tell you about the sea monsters that medieval sailors believed lurked there, or the paradise that might lie just beyond the horizon. The modern map has been purged of its dragons and its dreams. It offers a world that is fully known, fully charted, and perhaps fully disenchanted. There are no more blank spaces for the imagination to roam. This is the profound challenge the Vinland Map throws at us. It refuses to fit neatly into our modern categories. It is too accurate in its depiction of Greenland and Europe to be dismissed as pure fantasy, yet it is too speculative in its inclusion of Vinland to be accepted as sober fact. It exists in a liminal space, forcing us to question our own cartographic prejudices. It suggests that our clean division between fact and fiction might be too simplistic for understanding how pre-modern people interacted with their world. For them, the line between a physically real place and a spiritually significant one was often blurred. The loss of continents like Vinland, therefore, is not just a historical oversight. It is a symptom of our having amputated a dimension of meaning from our understanding of geography. The map becomes a metaphor for a larger shift in human consciousness from a world alive with story and symbol to a world that is, for better and for worse, a collection of measurable facts. The Vinland Map asks us if, in our drive to map every inch of the planet, we have forgotten how to map the human experience of wonder that those unknown spaces once represented. For centuries, the debate over the Vinland Map has been fought with the tools of chemistry and art history, but we have now entered a new era of investigation, one where the most powerful magnifying glass is not a lens but a line of code. The 21st century has brought a suite of digital technologies to the table that are fundamentally changing how we interrogate this ancient parchment, allowing us to see not just what is on the surface, but the very story of its creation, layer by microscopic layer. This is digital archaeology, and it offers a fresh hope of moving beyond the stalemate of the past by asking a different kind of question, instead of simply demanding, is it real? We can now inquire, how was it made? The journey to an answer begins with light, but not as our eyes perceive it. The most revolutionary of these tools is multispectral imaging. Think of it as a form of superhuman vision, where we see a single, faded image. A multispectral camera captures dozens of images, each taken at a specific wavelength of light, from ultraviolet to infrared. Different materials, different types of ink, parchment, or even stains interact with these wavelengths in unique ways. A line that is virtually invisible to our eyes might glow brightly under infrared light because the carbon in the ink absorbs that wavelength differently than the animal skin of the parchment. This technology can achieve something that feels like magic. It can peer beneath the surface. It can reveal underdrawings, the faint preliminary sketches a cartographer might have made before committing to the final lines. It can detect erased or scraped away text, the ghost of a previous message that was deemed incorrect or unnecessary. Most importantly, for the Vinland Map, it can potentially reveal the sequence in which the ink was applied. This ability to discern chronological order is the key to unlocking one of the map's central mysteries. Was the entire document, including the controversial Vinland portion, drawn in a single, continuous campaign by one hand, or does the technology reveal a more complex history? Imagine if the multispectral analysis showed that the coastlines of Europe and Africa were drawn first, and then, only later, the ink for the island of Vinland was added. This would be a powerful indicator that the New World segment was a later insertion, potentially strengthening the case for forgery. Conversely, if the analysis demonstrates that all the black ink lines, from the room lines to the shape of Vinland itself, were applied in an uninterrupted sequence with the same ink batch, it would lend significant weight to the argument for a unified, authentic creation. It transforms the debate from interpreting chemical anomalies to observing the physical actions of the mapmaker, frozen in time. Beyond seeing the invisible, digital technology also allows for a new kind of comparative analysis that is both vast and incredibly precise. Computational paleography involves feeding high-resolution images of the map's handwritten Latin inscriptions into sophisticated algorithms. These algorithms are then trained on vast databases containing thousands of digitized manuscripts from the 14th and 15th centuries, each one meticulously dated and located. The software doesn't get tired or biased. It analyzes the letter forms with microscopic attention to detail: the specific curve of a G, the angle of a serif, the spacing between letters. It can then statistically compare the handwriting on the Vinland Map against this enormous corpus, searching for the closest matches in style and, crucially, in time. Does the script most closely resemble work from a German scriptorium in 1440? Or does it share more features with a 19th-century hand imitating a medieval style? This quantitative approach provides a data-driven opinion on the map's paleography, supplementing the sometimes subjective judgments of human experts. Similarly, the cartographic style itself can be subjected to this computational scrutiny. The precise angles of the wind, roses, the curvature of the coastlines, the density of the place names, all these features can be measured and compared against a database of authenticated Portolan charts. The algorithm can identify subtle, almost imperceptible patterns and habits that are the unique fingerprint of a particular cartographic school or period. This isn't about whether the map looks right to a modern scholar. It's about whether its mathematical and artistic DNA aligns with other known works from the claimed era. This digital detective work can either reveal telling anachronisms or provide a powerful confirmation of the map's stylistic consistency, offering a new layer of objective evidence in a debate long dominated by interpretation. Perhaps the most profound aspect of this technological revolution is its non-invasive nature. For decades, the only way to analyze the ink or parchment was to take a physical sample, a process that inevitably damages the irreplaceable artifact. These tiny holes, while necessary for past science, are a permanent scar. Digital analysis changes this paradigm completely. Multispectral imaging and computational comparisons require only light and a digital sensor. The map can be studied down to the fiber of its parchment without a single speck of it being harmed. This means that the investigation can continue indefinitely, with each new technological advance offering a fresh perspective. As imaging resolution improves and algorithms become more sophisticated, we may be able to extract information from the map that is simply invisible to the tools of today. The Vinland Map can remain intact, a silent witness, while the digital proxies we create of it yield their secrets slowly over time. This shift to digital archaeology represents our best hope for a nuanced resolution. The goal is no longer a simple, binary verdict of real or fake. The history of this document may be far more complex. Perhaps it is a genuine 15th century parchment that was significantly altered or added to in a later century. Perhaps it is a modern creation that expertly reused a blank medieval skin. The power of these new tools is their ability to unravel this timeline of creation with forensic precision. They allow us to deconstruct the map into its constituent events, to separate the original hand from later additions, and to understand the journey this single sheet of parchment has taken through history. By peering into the microscopic world of the ink and the parchment, we are not just looking for an answer, we are learning to read the map's biography, written in the faintest of traces, waiting for the right light to finally make it legible. This journey across the Atlantic was not a pleasure cruise. It was a high-stakes expedition driven by the harsh economic realities of life on the edge of the known world. To understand why the Norse ventured to Vinland, and more importantly, why they ultimately walked away, we need to look at their balance sheet. The settlements in Greenland, established by Eric the Red around 986, were perpetually precarious. Perched on the very fringe of the habitable world, these communities were not self-sufficient paradises. They existed as specialized outposts, their survival intricately tied to a long and perilous supply line stretching back to Europe. Their primary export, the commodity that made the entire risky endeavor worthwhile, was walrus ivory. In medieval Europe, ivory was a luxury good, prized for carving religious objects, decorative items, and chess pieces. Greenland had walruses in abundance, and their tusks became the economic lifeblood of the Norse settlers, traded for essential goods like iron, timber, and grain that they couldn't produce in sufficient quantities themselves. This was a fragile economy, entirely dependent on the demand for ivory and the safe passage of ships across the treacherous North Atlantic. It was within this context of scarcity that the reports from Vinland would have sounded like a siren's call. The Sagas describe a land of almost mythical abundance. While Greenland was a landscape of rock and ice, Vinland offered vast, untouched forests. For the Norse, timber was not just a building material, it was the foundation of their civilization. Their iconic longships, their homes, their tools, all required wood. In Greenland, suitable timber was so scarce that it had to be painstakingly gathered as driftwood. The prospect of a coastline dense with tall, straight trees was like discovering a gold mine. Furthermore, the mention of wild grapes promised a potential source of wine, a valuable trade item, and a taste of the civilized world they had left behind. Here was a land that could solve their two greatest material shortages, wood and a high-value agricultural product. The initial economic motive for exploration, therefore, was overpoweringly clear. Vinland was not just a new land, it was a potential solution to Greenland's chronic supply problems. But potential profit is only one side of the equation. The other, just as crucial, is cost. And the costs of exploiting Vinland were staggering. The voyage itself was a monumental undertaking, sailing a Viking Nar, a sturdy but open cargo ship, across the stormy, iceberg-filled North Atlantic was a journey that could take weeks with no guarantee of safe arrival. The logistical challenge of establishing a permanent settlement so far from their Greenlandic support base was immense. They would need to transport not just people, but livestock, tools, and all the supplies needed to survive until they could become self-sufficient. This was a massive investment of manpower and resources for a community that already lived on a razor's edge. The risk recalculation would have been a constant topic of discussion around the hearths in Greenland. Was the reward of timber and grapes worth the very real possibility of losing ships, cargo, and lives to the unforgiving sea? This calculation was dramatically altered by a factor the Norse could not control and had not fully anticipated: the people who were already there. The sagas refer to the indigenous inhabitants as Skraelings, a term whose exact meaning is debated but likely conveyed a sense of otherness or barbarian. The initial encounters described in the stories are a mix of cautious trade and sudden, violent conflict. The Norse, with their metal weapons and imposing presence, may have initially held a technological advantage, but they were vastly outnumbered and operating thousands of miles from home. The Skraelings, who historians believe were likely the Beothuk people or ancestors of the Dorset culture, knew the land intimately and could mobilize significant forces. The sagas tell of battles where the Norse, for all their martial prowess, were simply overwhelmed. This wasn't a matter of a few skirmishes, it was a fundamental barrier to colonization. A sustainable settlement requires security. It requires the ability to farm, hunt, and log without constant fear of attack. The hostile resistance made any large-scale, long-term economic exploitation of Vinland's resources a military impossibility for the small numbers of Norse who could be supported logistically. When you weigh the immense costs, the dangerous voyage, the logistical nightmare, and the persistent military threat against the potential benefits, the Norse decision to abandon Vinland begins to look less like a failure and more like a starkly rational business choice. The timber and grapes were valuable, but they were not priceless. Europe already had sources for both. Vinland's resources would have to be extraordinarily cheap to justify the astronomical cost of extraction and transportation. Given the challenges, they simply weren't. There was no equivalent to the gold and silver that would later lure the Spanish to the Americas. For the Norse of Greenland, continuing to focus on their core business, the walrus ivory trade was a safer and more reliable economic strategy. Venturing to Markland, the forest land believed to be Labrador, for occasional logging expeditions was one thing. It was closer and perhaps involved less resistance. But committing to a full-scale colonization of the more distant and heavily defended Vinland was a gamble with odds that were, from their perspective, unacceptably poor. This economic explanation reframes the entire concept of a lost continent. Vinland wasn't lost to a failure of memory or a cataclysm that erased all knowledge. It was deliberately let go. The knowledge of its existence was preserved for centuries in the Sagas, a testament to its impact, but the collective decision, born of generations of experience, was that it was not worth the effort. The continent was acknowledged, mapped in their oral traditions, and then consciously placed on a shelf, deemed an unprofitable venture. This tells us something profound about history, that the course of human exploration is not a straight line of inevitable progress. It is a zigzagging path shaped by cold, hard calculations. A landmass as vast and fertile as North America remained peripheral to Europe for 500 more years, not because it was unknown, but because, for the Norse at least, the balance sheet simply didn't add up. It would take a different world with new technologies, different economic pressures, and a desperate search for a sea route to Asia to make that calculation change. Now, as we contemplate a continent that was discovered and then deliberately left behind, our minds naturally drift to the most famous lost land of all, one that met a far more dramatic fate. The story of Atlantis, first told by the Greek philosopher Plato more than 2,000 years ago, is the ultimate archetype of the vanished civilization. In his dialogues, Plato describes Atlantis as a formidable naval power, an island nation larger than ancient Libya and Asia Minor combined, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we know as the Strait of Gibraltar. This was no ordinary place. It was a utopia of immense wealth and advanced engineering, with concentric rings of water and land, hot and cold springs, and a magnificent palace at its heart. But its people grew arrogant and morally corrupt, and as punishment from the gods, the entire island was swallowed by the sea in a single cataclysmic day and night, vanishing forever beneath the waves. This narrative of a glorious rise and a sudden, divine punishment has captivated the human imagination for millennia, inspiring countless theories, expeditions, and works of fiction. The fundamental difference between Atlantis and Vinland lies in their origins within the historical record. Atlantis springs fully formed from the mind of a philosopher. Plato presented it not as a historical account, but as a moral allegory, a story designed to illustrate his ideas about the ideal state and the dangers of hubris. There is no archaeological evidence for Atlantis, no sunken ruins that have been conclusively identified. Its existence begins and ends in the realm of literature and myth. Vinland, on the other hand, emerges from a completely different tradition. Its roots are in the Norse sagas, which are family histories, epic tales of exploration and settlement passed down through generations. While these contain legendary elements, they are grounded in specific geographical details and the lives of real, traceable people like Leif Erikson. And most importantly, the core truth of the Viking voyages was spectacularly confirmed by the discovery of Elands Ox Meadows. Vinland has one foot firmly planted in verifiable history, while Atlantis floats entirely in the sea of legend. Yet placing these two stories side by side is incredibly revealing. Both Atlantis and Vinland tap into a deep and universal human fascination with lands that are no longer there. They represent a powerful cultural motif, the longing for a lost golden age, a pristine and abundant world that existed before some great fall or some great forgetting. This motif speaks to a sense that our current world is somehow diminished, that we have lost knowledge or territories that our ancestors once possessed. Whether it is a high-tech paradise sunk by its own pride or a fertile wineland abandoned for pragmatic reasons, the idea of a vanished continent serves as a blank canvas upon which we can project our own hopes, fears, and questions about the past. It allows us to wonder what might have been and what secrets the Earth might still be hiding. This is where the Vinland Map performs its most fascinating magic. It acts as a bridge between these two worlds, the world of myth and the world of documented history. By depicting Vinland on a physical parchment, the map takes a story that has the structure of a legend-brave explorers discovering a bountiful land across the sea and gives it the authority of a cartographic document. It demonstrates the precise mechanism by which a real, discoverable place can slowly acquire the mystical aura of a legend. Imagine the process. Norse settlers returned to Greenland with incredible tales of a new world. Those stories are told and retold for generations in the sagas. A century or two later, a scholar or a mapmaker, working with these old tales, incorporates this Vinland into a map of the world. Then, as the Greenland colony itself fails and contact is lost, the map becomes an orphaned relic. The knowledge it represents fades from living memory. The land it depicts, once visited and mapped, slowly retreats into the realm of rumor and fantasy. It becomes a cartographic ghost, not unlike Atlantis. The comparison, therefore, challenges the clean division we often like to make between history and myth. We tend to think of them as separate categories. One is fact, the other fiction. But the journey of the Vinland story shows us that the line is far more porous. Historical events, when they are not continuously reinforced by evidence and memory, can easily cross over into the landscape of folklore. Details become exaggerated, timelines compress, and the narrative is shaped to fit cultural needs. The story of Vinland could have easily traveled south from Iceland and Greenland, becoming distorted with each retelling until it was indistinguishable from the many other tales of phantom islands in the Atlantic. The existence of the map and the archaeological site pulls it back from that brink, but it shows us how thin that line really is. Atlantis may be pure myth, but its enduring power reminds us that even our driest historical facts were once vibrant stories, and that every map, in its own way, is a collection of stories we have chosen to believe, at least for a while. But this process of forgetting is not a simple accident, a passive fading of memory like an old photograph left in the sun. It is something far more active and deliberate. Societies do not just lose information, they curate it. They make constant, often unconscious, decisions about what knowledge is essential for their survival and identity, and what can be allowed to slip away. For the Norse settlers in Greenland, the memory of Vinland was not a trivial piece of folklore. It was a vital part of their origin story, a testament to their adventurous spirit, and a reminder of a resource-rich land that might one day be needed again. This knowledge would have been kept alive around winter fires in the sagas recited by skalds, passed from one generation to the next as long as the community itself endured. The memory was practical, tied to their very understanding of their place in the world. The real forgetting began when the community that held that memory ceased to exist. By the 15th century, the Norse settlements in Greenland, which had thrived for centuries, entered a period of terminal decline. The exact causes are still debated, but a combination of factors likely conspired against them. A climatic shift known as the Little Ice Age made an already marginal environment even harsher, shortening growing seasons and increasing sea ice, which would have disrupted the vital trade routes with Europe. They may have faced increased conflict with the expanding Inuit population, and as the market for their primary export, walrus ivory, dwindled in Europe, replaced by sources from Africa and Asia, their economic reason for existing evaporated. Isolated, starving, and cut off, the last Norse Greenlander died, and with them, the living, breathing, oral tradition that contained the first-hand geographical knowledge of Vinland. The memory didn't just fade, the vessel that carried it sank. In Europe, the situation was different, but the outcome was the same. Imagine a piece of information arriving in a 14th century European court or monastery, a rumor of a land across the Western Ocean discovered by Norse sailors. How would it have been received without the context of a thriving Greenland colony to give it weight? It would have been just one more strange tale among many. Europe was brimming with reports of distant lands from returning crusaders, merchants traveling the Silk Road, and missionaries venturing into the steppes of Asia. A story about a cold, distant land called Vineland, with few immediate trade opportunities and inhabited by hostile peoples, would have seemed far less compelling than accounts of the spice-rich Indies or the gold of Africa. The knowledge was likely fragmentary, inconsistent, and most importantly, not practically useful. It didn't help a merchant in Venice calculate his profits or a king in Portugal plan a new trade route. It was, in the most literal sense, not valuable information, and information that has no perceived value is not systematically preserved. This becomes especially clear with the arrival of the printing press in the mid-15th century. The age of print created a new kind of memory, durable, widespread, and standardized, but it also created a filter. What got printed was what publishers believed would sell, what the church approved, and what the educated elite deemed important. The scattered manuscripts that might have contained references to Vinland were not deemed worthy of mass reproduction. They were like emails deleted from a server to save space, making room for what the culture considered the truly important data: classical texts, religious works, and information about the known world of Europe, Africa, and Asia. The knowledge of Vinland failed to make the transition from the fragile, decentralized memory of handwritten manuscripts to the robust, institutional memory of print. It was left behind in the analog age. This is the profound power of the Vinland Map. If it is genuine, it is not merely a map. It is a fossil of a memory that was on the verge of extinction. It is a snapshot of a moment just before the final curtain fell, a last-ditch effort by some unknown cartographer to inscribe a disappearing truth onto parchment before it was gone forever. It represents a pathway not taken, a branch of geographical knowledge that was pruned from the great tree of European understanding because it bore no immediate fruit. The map challenges our assumption that history is a straight line of accumulating knowledge. Instead, it shows us that history is a landscape full of dead ends and abandoned trails, and that what we know about the past is not just a record of what happened, but a collection of what successive generations have decided was worth carrying forward. The continents we lose are not always those that sink beneath the sea. sometimes they are the ones we simply stop looking for. The undeniable proof of a Norse presence at Elands Meadows does more than just rewrite a single chapter in the history books. It fundamentally reshapes the entire library of human exploration. It forces us to confront a thrilling and radical possibility. If one group of intrepid sailors could cross the Atlantic a full 500 years before Columbus, then why not others? The Viking settlement acts like a key, unlocking a door to a much broader and more complex historical landscape, one where the oceans may not have been the impermeable barriers we once imagined, but rather vast highways occasionally traversed by the most daring adventurers from civilizations we would never think to connect. Perhaps the most compelling of these alternative theories involves not the icy North Atlantic, but the sprawling expanse of the Pacific Ocean. For centuries, scholars have been puzzled by the curious case of the sweet potato. This sturdy, nutritious tuber is indisputably a plant native to the Americas. Yet, centuries before European contact, it was being cultivated across a vast swath of Polynesia, from Hawaii to New Zealand to Easter Island. The native name for the sweet potato in many of these Polynesian languages, kumara, bears a striking resemblance to its name in some Andean languages, kumul. This is far more than a linguistic coincidence. It strongly suggests a transfer of both the plant and its name. But how did it happen? The prevailing theory points to the Polynesians, the greatest open ocean navigators in human history. Using nothing more than their profound knowledge of stars, ocean currents, and bird migration patterns, they conquered the Pacific in magnificent double-hulled canoes. It is entirely plausible that a Polynesian voyage, perhaps blown off course or simply pushing the boundaries of the known world, could have reached the coast of South America. There, they would have encountered the sweet potato, recognized its value as a reliable food source for long voyages, and brought it back with them, successfully introducing it to their island homelands. This wasn't a mission of colonization, but a chance encounter that left a permanent botanical fingerprint on the other side of the world. Venturing further into the realm of speculation, we encounter theories that reach back to the very dawn of Western civilization. Could the Phoenicians, the legendary merchant mariners of the ancient Mediterranean, have ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules? These master sailors established trade routes that stretched from their home in the Levant all the way to Britain in search of tin. Some tantalizing but highly controversial artifacts have been put forward as evidence, like the Bat Creek stone found in Tennessee in the 19th century, which some claimed bore Paleo-Hebrew inscriptions. Most mainstream archaeologists dismiss these finds as misinterpretations or hoaxes, arguing there is no credible archaeological evidence for a Phoenician presence. Similarly, fringe theories suggest that Roman ships, perhaps caught in a storm, might have been carried across the Atlantic. The idea is fueled by occasional discoveries of Roman-era coins in the Americas, though these are almost certainly losses from much later colonial-era collectors rather than proof of ancient voyages. The evidence here is thin, often resting on ambiguous artifacts that are fiercely debated. Yet, the sheer seafaring capability of these cultures means that while proof is lacking, the possibility, however remote, cannot be entirely ruled out. Then there is the staggering proposition of Chinese exploration. The most famous account comes from the supposed voyages of a Muslim Chinese admiral named Zheng He in the early 15th century. According to a controversial theory put forward by author Gavin Menzies, Zheng He's massive treasure fleets, which were known to have sailed as far as East Africa, may have continued across the Indian and Atlantic Oceans, mapping the world and even establishing settlements in the Americas. While this theory is overwhelmingly rejected by professional historians due to a complete lack of evidence in the extensive Chinese records of the time, it speaks to a broader point. It highlights the incredible maritime technology possessed by non-European cultures, technology that was, in many cases, far superior to what Columbus had at his disposal. The verified existence of the Vikings makes these more speculative theories slightly less fantastical. It establishes a precedent, proving that transoceanic travel was achievable with ancient and medieval technology. It encourages us to look at the entire map of the ancient world not as a collection of isolated bubbles, but as a dynamic system where threads of contact, however faint and fragile, might have occasionally stretched across the deepest waters. This shift in perspective is the true legacy of the Vinland Map's mystery. It challenges the Eurocentric narrative of discovery that has dominated for centuries, a narrative that often paints the rest of the world as static and waiting to be found. Instead, it suggests a model of sporadic, episodic contact. The oceans were not empty, they were punctuated by these incredible, against-all-odds journeys. Most of these contacts would have been brief and left little lasting impact. A Polynesian canoe landing on a Peruvian beach, trading goods and ideas, and then returning home. A Norse ship spending a single winter in Newfoundland before the logistical challenges and hostile encounters forced a retreat. These were not the beginnings of mass migration or conquest. They were fleeting moments of connection that flickered brightly and then vanished, their stories preserved only in legend or, in the case of the Vikings, in a single, controversial piece of parchment. The map reminds us that history is not just about the empires that endured, but also about the lonely voyages that failed, the discoveries that were forgotten, and the countless stories that were lost to the sea. It asks us to consider a world where human curiosity and courage constantly tested the limits of the possible, long before any single culture claimed the credit for unlocking the globe. And so we arrive at a concept that turns our entire understanding of cartography on its head. We tend to think of a map's value lying in the lines that are drawn, the coastlines meticulously charted, the cities carefully labeled. But the true power of a map, especially an ancient one, often resides in the exact opposite, in the empty spaces, the vast areas left deliberately or unknowingly blank. These are not simple absences of information, they are active statements. On a medieval chart, a blank space was a question mark written large across the parchment, an open invitation to the imagination. It was a territory where the known rules of geography ceased to apply, and where a cartographer could give form to the deepest fears and wildest hopes of their culture. This is where you would find the warning, "Here be dragons," a phrase that speaks volumes about the medieval mind. It wasn't necessarily a claim that literal fire-breathing beasts lived there. It was a symbolic way of saying, beyond this point, we cannot guarantee your safety. Here there be dangers beyond our comprehension. The Vinland Map achieves something truly radical because it dares to fill one of these blank spaces not with a monster, but with a name. In the vast, terrifying emptiness of the Western Ocean, it inscribes Vinlandia Insula. This single act transforms the nature of the unknown. It changes the Atlantic from a realm of pure potential and fear into a place that can be named, discussed, and potentially visited. It takes a legend and gives it a cartographic address. This is profoundly challenging to our modern sensibility, where we are used to maps that strive for total coverage. Our digital maps have seemingly erased blank spaces altogether. We can zoom in to see individual streets on the other side of the planet. We have come to see maps as authoritative, final statements of fact. The Vinland Map reminds us that this is a very recent development. For most of history, a map was not a perfect replica of reality. It was a working document, a mixture of hard-won knowledge, educated guesses, and cultural baggage. Its blank spaces were as honest as its filled-in coastlines because they openly admitted the limits of what was known. This leads us to a fascinating and counterintuitive idea. The continents we no longer acknowledge, like Vinland on this map, did not vanish because they were proven false. In a way, they vanished because our maps got better. As the age of exploration gave way to the Enlightenment and then to the modern scientific era, the goal of cartography shifted from illustrating a qualitative understanding of the world to achieving a quantitative, precise measurement of it. Explorers like Captain Cook filled in the blank spaces with hard data. The great southern continent, Terra Australis Incognita, didn't disappear in a cataclysm. It was systematically erased from the map because ship after ship sailed through its supposed location and found only open ocean. This was a triumph of empiricism, but it also came with a loss. The new, more accurate maps created a different kind of blank space, not a space of imaginative possibility, but a space of definitive absence. A place that was not on the new, precise map was now officially declared not to exist. Vinland and other phantom lands became casualties of this new accuracy. They were pushed out of geography and into the realm of folklore and myth. There's a poignant analogy here with the concept of extinction. A species that goes extinct doesn't just cease to exist in the present, it is erased from the future's catalogue of life. Similarly, a continent that is removed from the map is erased from the future's geographical imagination. It becomes a cartographic ghost. The blank spaces on our modern maps are not realms of possibility. They are simply oceans already measured and named. We have gained an incredible amount of certainty, but we may have lost something equally valuable, a sense of the world's lingering mystery. The medieval mapmaker, staring at a blank space, could populate it with dragons, with the kingdom of Prester John, or with the island of High Brassel. We, staring at the blue of an ocean on a satellite map, see only water. Our world has been disenchanted by its own completeness. The enduring fascination of the Vinland Map is that it captures a moment right in the middle of this great transition. It is a document that tries to bring the old world of imaginative geography and the new world of empirical discovery into conversation. It uses the practical, measured style of a Portolan chart to make a claim that was, for its time, as fantastical as any dragon. It forces us to consider that our current map of the world, for all its stunning accuracy, is still just a snapshot. It represents our best understanding today, but it is not the final word. There are still blank spaces in our knowledge, though they have moved from the geographical to the historical, the archaeological, and the depths of the ocean. The map challenges us to look at our own certainties with a bit of humility, to remember that every map is a product of its time's knowledge, and more importantly, of its ignorance. The most truthful part of any map might not be the lines we draw with such confidence, but the honest admission of what we have yet to discover. And so we arrive at perhaps the most profound and difficult question raised by this ancient map, one that moves beyond the scientific debate and into the very heart of how we understand our past and its relationship to our present. The rediscovery of a land like Vinland isn't just an academic exercise. It forces a modern ethical confrontation over the concept of ownership itself. When a continent is found and then lost in the European record, who truly has the right to claim its story? The map seems to present a straightforward historical correction, suggesting that the Norse, not Columbus, were the first Europeans to reach the Americas. This immediately challenges the traditional narrative that has been celebrated for centuries, a narrative deeply embedded in the national identities of many countries in the Western Hemisphere. It appears to shift the title of first from one group of Europeans to another, potentially rewriting the opening chapter of the age of colonialism. But this perspective rests on a fundamental and deeply problematic assumption that the land was ever available to be discovered in the first place. For the countless indigenous nations of North America, from the Inuit in the Arctic to the complex societies that stretched down both coasts and across the continents, the question of who arrived first from Europe is not just irrelevant, it is a continuation of a colonial mindset. Their ancestors had been living on, shaping, and belonging to these lands for tens of thousands of years. From their viewpoint, the arrival of the Norse around the year 1000, just like the arrival of Columbus in 1492, was simply the first documented incident of outsiders showing up on a shoreline that was already home to a rich tapestry of cultures and civilizations. The land was not lost to them, it was and remains their ancestral territory. The very act of debating which Europeans got there first inadvertently reinforces the idea that history only begins when Europeans arrive, effectively erasing millennia of prior human existence and sovereignty. This is where the Vinland Map transforms from a curious artifact into a powerful political symbol. It becomes a lens through which we can examine the ongoing struggle over historical narrative and cultural patrimony. Who gets to tell the story of a place? For most of modern history, the answer has been the colonizers. Their records, their maps, their perspectives have been privileged as the official account, while indigenous oral histories and knowledge systems were often dismissed as myth or legend. The intense scholarly focus on authenticating the Vinland Map, on proving a European presence half a millennium before Columbus, can be seen as a reflection of this same impulse, a desire to find validation within a European framework. Yet, the map's existence, if genuine, also subtly undermines the notion of Columbus's unique, world-changing achievement, creating a crack in the monolithic edifice of colonial history through which other, older narratives can begin to seep back into public consciousness. The ethical dilemma extends beyond historical bragging rights into the very tangible realm of land rights and cultural heritage. In recent decades, there has been a growing global movement to repatriate cultural artifacts and human remains to their indigenous communities, and to acknowledge the lasting impacts of colonial dispossession. The debate over the Vinland Map intersects with these contemporary discussions in a poignant way. It reminds us that the question of who was here first is not an abstract historical puzzle. It has been used for centuries to justify displacement, treaty violations, and the erosion of indigenous sovereignty. To celebrate the Norse as the first discoverers without centering the prior and continuous presence of indigenous peoples risks repeating a familiar pattern of exclusion. A more nuanced approach would use the map not to replace one European claim with another, but to highlight the complexity of human migration and the profound depth of indigenous connection to the land, a connection that predates any outside contact by an unimaginable span of time. Ultimately, the map challenges us to move beyond a simplistic, possession-based view of history. Instead of asking who can claim this lost continent, perhaps we should be asking what can this lost continent teach us about sharing the stories of our world. The true value of the Vinland Map may not lie in settling a score between European explorers, but in its ability to prompt a more inclusive and humble conversation. It shows us that the past is not a single, settled story, but a mosaic of overlapping experiences and perspectives. By acknowledging the Norse voyages without diminishing the paramount rights and histories of indigenous peoples, we can begin to construct a historical narrative that is not about claiming ownership, but about understanding the intricate and often painful web of encounters that have shaped the modern world. The map, in the end, is a call to listen to all the voices in the story, not just the ones that wrote themselves onto the parchment first. Perhaps the most profound lesson the Vinland Map imparts is that the quest for historical truth is often more valuable than the truth itself. We live in an age that craves definitive answers, where complex issues are often reduced to binary choices of right or wrong, true or false. We expect our history books to deliver clean, settled narratives. But this map stubbornly resists that simplification. It exists in a state of permanent ambiguity, a puzzle that has consumed the energies of brilliant minds for decades without yielding a final verdict. And it is precisely this unresolved tension that makes it such a powerful teaching tool. It forces us to sit with uncertainty, to understand that the past is not a locked vault of facts waiting to be opened, but a vast, dimly lit landscape that we are constantly resurveying with new tools and new questions. The map's true story may never be known, but the intense, multi-generational effort to uncover it reveals something far more important about how knowledge is actually built, not through sudden, brilliant revelations, but through painstaking, collaborative, and often contentious dialogue. This process of historical investigation is a powerful antidote to intellectual arrogance. When we confront an artifact like the Vinland Map, we are humbled. The initial, confident pronouncements made at its discovery, both for and against its authenticity, were almost immediately complicated by new evidence. The radiocarbon dating of the parchment seemed to settle the matter until the analysis of the ink introduced a confounding variable. The stylistic analysis by art historians pointed in one direction, while the chemical analysis by materials scientists pointed in another. This back and forth is not a sign of failure within the academic community. It is the sound of the scientific and historical methods working exactly as they should. It is a messy, iterative process of proposing a theory, testing it against evidence, and being willing to revise that theory when new data emerges. The map teaches us that our current understanding is always provisional, a best-fit model based on the information available today, and that model must be flexible enough to change when tomorrow's discovery arrives. Furthermore, the mystery underscores the critical necessity of interdisciplinary thinking. No single expert, no matter how brilliant in their own field, could hope to solve this puzzle alone. The cartographer needed the historian to understand the context of 15th century exploration. The historian needed the chemist to analyze the physical composition of the ink. The chemist needed the Latin paleographer to assess the handwriting, and all of them needed the archaeologist, whose spade turned over the soil at Elant's Meadows to provide an undeniable anchor of truth against which the map's claims could be measured. The Vineland Map is a case study in how siloed expertise leads to incomplete answers. The most compelling insights have emerged at the intersections of these disciplines, where a question from one field forces a revolution in thinking within another. It demonstrates that complex historical problems cannot be solved with a single tool. They require a whole toolkit wielded by a diverse team of specialists who are willing to listen to and learn from one another. Ultimately, the map's greatest value may lie not in what it tells us about the 15th century, but in what it reveals about ourselves. It holds up a mirror to our own desires and biases. For those who want to believe in the bold Norse explorers, the map is a thrilling validation, a tangible link to the Sagas. For the skeptics who prize scientific rigor above all, the anomalous ink is a satisfying confirmation of their critical worldview. We each see in its faded lines a reflection of what we hope history to be. This is an inescapable part of the human condition. We are not dispassionate computers processing data. We are storytellers seeking patterns and narratives that make sense of our world. The Vinland Map challenges us to acknowledge these biases, to recognize the stories we are tempted to project onto the past, and to strive for a balance between healthy skepticism and open-minded wonder. It shows us that history is not just a collection of facts, but a continuous conversation between the past and the present, a conversation that is as much about who we are now as it is about what happened then. The most tantalizing aspect of the Vinland Map is that its final chapter has not been written. This is not a cold case from the distant past, but a live investigation where the next breakthrough could be just one technological innovation away. The debate over its authenticity is no longer confined to dusty library corners. It has entered the realm of high-tech laboratories, where scientists are developing methods of analysis so precise they can almost read the history of the ink molecule by molecule. The central question, of course, remains the ink. While past studies detected anatase, the science of material analysis has advanced exponentially. Researchers are now exploring techniques like synchrotron radiation, which uses incredibly powerful X-rays to map the chemical composition of the ink in microscopic detail. This could potentially reveal not just what elements are present, but their specific crystalline structure and distribution. If the anatase particles are found to be uniformly mixed throughout the ink line, it would strongly suggest a modern, synthetic origin. However, if the particles are clustered only on the surface or in specific, isolated spots, it would lend powerful support to the contamination theory, indicating that a modern substance interacted with the parchment long after the map was originally drawn. This level of detail could finally tip the scales in a debate that has been deadlocked for decades. Beyond the chemistry of the map itself, another thrilling frontier lies in the uncharted territory of the world's archives. The discovery that bound the Vinland Map to the Speculum Historiale was a reminder that medieval manuscripts are often found in unexpected combinations. Countless libraries and private collections across Europe, particularly in monasteries and old aristocratic estates, still contain uncatalogued or poorly examined volumes from the medieval period. The digital revolution is now making it possible to search these collections with unprecedented efficiency. Scholars are using sophisticated text recognition software to scan through digitized copies of thousands of manuscripts, searching not for the phrase Vinland, but for related terms, for descriptions of lands to the west, or for geographical treatises that seem to contain knowledge that shouldn't be there. It is entirely plausible that a forgotten manuscript tucked away in a Vatican vault or a Scandinavian university library contains a passing reference, a marginal note, or even a crude sketch that corroborates the information on the Vinland Map. Finding a second, independent source that mentions a cartographic representation of a land across the Atlantic would be a game-changer, providing the contextual evidence that the map has always lacked. Perhaps the most concrete path to resolving the mystery lies not in libraries but beneath the waves. The confirmed Norse site at Elands Meadows was a monumental find, but it is widely believed to have been a gateway, a base for further exploration rather than the main destination. This suggests that other, smaller Norse sites must exist along the coastline of Canada and the United States. The challenge is that 1,000 years of coastal erosion, rising sea levels, and forest growth have likely submerged or buried these encampments. Underwater archaeology is now advancing to the point where systematic searches of promising bays and inlets are becoming feasible. Using advanced sonar and magnetometer surveys, archaeologists can scan the seabed for anomalies that resemble Norse artifacts, like iron ship rivets or distinctive stone tools. A single, authenticated Norse artifact discovered south of Newfoundland, in an area consistent with the Saga descriptions of a warmer, grape-growing region, would provide the monumental corroboration the map's specific details desperately need. It would transform Vinland from a general concept into a mapped territory, proving that the Norse possessed a geographical understanding of North America that was precise enough to be charted. The enduring power of this mystery is that it connects so many different fields of study. A new ink analysis in a physics lab can change the interpretation of a Latin inscription studied by a philologist, which in turn can redirect the focus of an archaeological dig on the other side of the Atlantic. This interdisciplinary conversation ensures that the Vinland Map will never be a static relic. Each new generation of historians, scientists, and explorers brings its own unique set of questions and tools to the puzzle. A climate scientist studying soil cores in Greenland might uncover evidence of a particularly favorable weather pattern that would have made transatlantic travel easier in a specific decade, narrowing the window for when the map could have been created. A geneticist studying the population history of Iceland might find evidence of a previously unknown lineage that traces back to North America, suggesting more sustained contact than we currently understand. The map acts as a central hub, connecting these disparate threads of inquiry into a single, grand investigation. This ongoing quest is a powerful reminder that history is not a sealed book but a living, breathing discipline. Our understanding of the past is constantly being revised, not because the facts change, but because our ability to interrogate them improves. The Vinland Map is a perfect symbol of this process. It refuses to offer an easy answer, instead inviting us to participate in the detective work. It challenges our assumptions about the limits of medieval knowledge and the neat timelines we construct for great historical events like the Age of Exploration. The lines on this piece of parchment are more than just a drawing. They are a question mark etched into history, a permanent invitation to wonder, to investigate, and to never stop being curious about the secrets our world still holds. The mystery endures not as a failure of scholarship, but as its greatest inspiration. So where does this long and winding journey leave us? After centuries of debate, after the most advanced scientific analysis, the Vinland Map remains an enigma, a question mark permanently inked onto parchment. And perhaps that is its greatest lesson. Whether this document is ultimately proven to be a genuine medieval treasure or a masterwork of deception, its true power lies in its ability to shake the foundations of what we think we know. It forces us to confront a humbling truth, that history is not a solid monument built from indisputable facts, but a flowing river, constantly reshaped by new evidence, new interpretations, and the simple, sobering passage of time. This single piece of parchment, with its cryptic lines and controversial chemistry, reveals not just a continent we no longer acknowledge, but entire narratives that have been submerged by the tide of conventional history, stories of exploration and contact that challenge the neat, linear timelines we find so comforting. This journey through cartographic mystery serves as a powerful reminder that the world has always been a far larger and more interconnected place than our textbooks sometimes suggest. Long before the age of empires and global trade routes, the oceans were being crossed by intrepid sailors in Viking longships, and knowledge of these journeys, however fragmented, was circulating through the ports and scriptoriums of the medieval world. The map hints at a hidden network of discovery, a subterranean current of geographical understanding that flowed beneath the surface of official history. It suggests that the human drive to explore, to push beyond the horizon, is a constant, and that our current map of the past is likely still missing many crucial pieces. The story of Vinland is a testament to the fact that great discoveries can be made, recorded, and then, for a complex web of reasons, simply fade from collective memory, waiting for a future generation to stumble upon their ghostly traces. Let this entire investigation be an open invitation to look at the world, and the maps we use to navigate it with a more questioning eye. The maps we trust today, with their satellite-perfected coastlines and pinpoint accuracy, seem like the ultimate authority. But they are also products of our own time, reflecting our priorities, our technologies, and yes, our own blind spots. They have successfully erased the dragons and the phantom islands, but in doing so, have they also erased a sense of wonder? What are the blank spaces on our modern maps? They are no longer geographical, they are historical, archaeological, and cultural. What assumptions are we filling them with? The Vinland Map urges us to be curious about those empty spaces, to wonder what truths might be hiding in plain sight, disguised as myth or dismissed as error. It challenges us to remember that every map is a story and every story can be revised. The mystery is far from over. New technologies will continue to probe the map's secrets, and perhaps a long-lost document in a forgotten archive will one day provide the missing key. But the conversation doesn't end here. We want to hear what you think. Does the evidence lean more toward an astonishing medieval reality or an elaborate 20th century hoax? What other historical mysteries captivate your imagination? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. This is a puzzle that thrives on diverse perspectives. And if you've enjoyed this journey into the hidden corners of history, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We have many more adventures planned, exploring the lost worlds, forgotten artifacts, and unsolved enigmas that continue to shape our understanding of the past. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the